Okay, up to now we've been focusing mainly on sensation. We really haven't been talking about perception. So now we're going to talk about perception, visual perception in particular. And again, this is where we are organizing and interpreting the signals that we're getting. Remember that the rods and the cones are detecting light. So the rods and the cones are specifically for detecting different colors. But basically, we're just getting these light signals. Well, how do we then interpret it? How do we know what we are seeing? So we see things, their shape, their depth, their motion, their constancy. In other words, we see, for example, objects in motion. We nevertheless see them as the same object moving. We detect that objects, even when they're moving, they change their shape and their size, but we don't. The image changes their shape and size, but we know that they don't change. So how is it that we can put all this together in our brain? And that's what we're going to be talking about. So we take these small pieces of a sensory experience and we put them into something meaningful that we can understand. And the whole is different from the sum of its parts. In other words, we're not just taking all of these stimuli the same way. We are processing them in special ways, such that what we are perceiving is not exactly pixel by pixel what we are sensing. Gestalt psychologists are interested in this concept of organization, this concept of seeing patterns, and this is applied to our understanding of perception. I'll show you how. Take a look at these principles of Gestalt. You have closure, proximity, and similarity. The way we perceive these stimuli are based on these patterns. So, for example, we perceive this as a triangle, but it really isn't a triangle because it's not connected. However, we kind of automatically put that in. Over here, we see 1, 2, 3, 4 objects here, but we see it as one whole object, one whole rectangle. Likewise, we see a bunch of objects here, but we see them put together into the shape of a horse, and we see one horse, not a whole bunch of pieces. Okay, so we tend to view, so in terms of the concept of closure, we tend to put things together that are apart, that where we seem to fill in the blanks. Essentially, is what closure does. We fill in the blanks. Proximity, we tend to group items that are close together. So, for example, here you see 16 squares, but rather you notice them as 4 lines. You see that the items that are close together, these 4 are close together, these 4 are close together, these 4 are close together, and these 4 are close together. So we group them together. Finally, we notice we group items that are similar together and separate them from those that are different. So you here see a bunch of squares and circles, but we then interpret them nevertheless as a column of circles, a column of squares, a column of circles, and a column of squares, and so on. So here are some other images of proximity and similarity. Again, it's the idea that we see we are sensing the stimuli, but in our brain we are grouping them by these specific rules, by proximity, by similarity, by closure. We're seeing items here. You see this as a circle, not a bunch of dashes. Okay? We perceive the incomplete figures as whole and complete. We tend to fill in the blanks. Another very important Gestalt principle in terms of the way we perceive the world around us is in figure and ground. When we perceive objects in front of us, we perceive it. When we perceive an image in front of us, we're looking for the object, which is the figure, and the surroundings, essentially in the background. We tend to look at objects. Like, for example, you're looking at a person. You don't pay attention to, you put the person in the foreground and the surroundings in the background. We tend to do this all the time, and oftentimes we don't necessarily even notice what's in the background. We're focusing so much on what is the object of our attention. So there's the figure in the ground. Furthermore, we see the figure as in front, and we see the surroundings in back. So it's a way also of seeing depth. We see the object as closer to us and the surroundings further back, even though the image that's projected onto our retina is not a 3D image. We're seeing the world as like a movie screen, but we perceive the depth in what we see. So here are some examples of artists of art that plays around with the concept of figure and ground. Over here, what do you see? Do you see men walking downstairs, arm in arm? Or do some of you see arrows up and down? Well, if you see arrows, then you're putting the white arrows in the foreground and you're putting the black in the background. If you see the men walking down the stairs, then you're putting the white in the background and the black in the foreground. Same thing over here. Do you see a white vase? Or do you see two faces staring at each other? If the black is the foreground, you see the faces. If the white is the foreground, then if the white is the foreground or the figure, you see the vase. If the black is the foreground or the figure, we see the faces. M.C. Escher is an artist who has done some amazing artwork that plays around with figure and ground. If you look at the picture on the left here, you see a bunch of birds in the sky, but if you get closer, those birds somehow turn into fishes in the black water here. So you see the foreground and the background melding together. Likewise over here, do you see a bunch of white angels or do you see a bunch of black demons? And you could see the foreground and the background right there. The Stroop effect is another way in which we tend to is a pattern in which we perceive things. We have the tendency to automatically perceive familiar stimuli, which is a good way in which which are shortcuts that allow us to get through the day much easier. Things that are familiar, we perceive them quickly, so we can move on and we can react more quickly. And reading is a very practiced automatic activity. If you learn to read, you do it all the time, then your reading becomes very fast and efficient. However, the Stroop effect shows how your automatic perception can mislead you if the task you're trying to do is different from what essentially goes against what is our automatic tendency. So, for example, if I were to ask you to point to each of if I were to ask you to identify the color of each of these rectangles, this is a very easy thing to do. So starting from the top left, got yellow, red, green, red, green, yellow, green, blue, red, blue, yellow, blue. Okay. Easy task. However, if I asked you to say the colors of the ink in the words you're seeing, that's going to be a lot tougher. This is red, this is green, this is yellow, this is blue, this is yellow, this is green, this is green, this is blue, this is red, this is red, this is red, and this is blue. Much harder to do because you automatically want to read the word. And our brain is telling you, read the word, read the word, read the word, and we have to kind of fight that. Now, the Stroop effect has actually been studied in a number of different contexts. And the idea being that many of us have these automatic perceptions that differ from somebody else. Someone who is depressed, for example, might automatically perceive things in a negative or sad way, while people who are not depressed are less likely to do that. And therefore, you can kind of, do a Stroop test that would kind of test that kind of automatic responding. How difficult is the task going to be when they think so automatically about that? Another important factor when it comes to our perception is the fact that we adapt to sensations. We are bombarded with sensory stimuli. All the time we are bombarded with it. However, we do not respond in a constant, we're not constantly on alert for every stimulus that hits us. If we were, we'd kind of go nuts. So we kind of have to, we reduce our responsiveness to stimuli that are constant, that are unchanging. Because constant stimuli we kind of see as not threatening, not dangerous, and we just kind of put it in the background and don't pay attention to it. And as an example of this, when you put on a pair of pants in the morning, you certainly feel the clothes on your skin, but as you kind of go through your day, you don't seem to notice it anymore. You've adapted to it. Because the constant stimulation of the pants on your skin, is not really anything, it's become constant, it's become kind of the usual aspect of the day, so you don't notice it anymore. And it doesn't mean that that you can't feel it. It just means that your responsiveness to it is very much decreased. And again, it kind of reduces the stimulus overload when it comes to your perception. Which brings us to the important concept of attention. As I said before, we are bombarded with stimuli. But we're receiving a whole bunch of stimuli all the time. The thing is, we do not have the ability to pay attention to everything. So, for example, going back to the issue of the object in the background, we can't pay attention to both the object in the foreground and the background. We kind of just pay attention to the object most of the time. So we are only able to pay attention to a little bit at a time, and that's and that's what we're talking about with attention. We can't see everything, so our attention is very selective. And again, if we're not paying attention to it, we're really not fully perceiving it. An example of selective attention is a cocktail party effect, where you might be in a noisy room and you might hear your name. And that name rings a bell for you and you react to it. Even though it's amongst all of the other noise, you hear it, you respond to it. It means that you are able to hear all of what's going on. But something clicks to your attention and then you can pay attention to it and focus on it. We tend to pay attention to things that have a novelty to it, that seem new, that seem different. Something that may be of an unusual size or an unusual color. Something that's moving when everything else is still. We pay attention to that. Sometimes we can be blinded by our emotions. Sometimes our emotions can make us essentially ignore stimuli that are in front of us because we're so maybe focused inward. If we're not paying attention to something, we're kind of blind to it. We might also be blind to things that change in front of us without even realizing they're changing. So there are some interesting examples of that. So here what I want you to do is I want you to take a look at this website and take this perception test. And I'm going to click on it here for you now.
The monkey business illusion. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the ball. Passes. Did you spot the gorilla? For people who haven't seen or heard about a video like this before, about half missed the gorilla. If you knew about the gorilla, you probably saw it. But did you notice the curtain changing color or the player on the black team leaving the game? Let's rewind and watch it again. When you're looking for a gorilla, you often miss other unexpected events. And that's the monkey business illusion. Learn more about this illusion and the original gorilla experiment at theinvisiblegorilla.com.
So, maybe you saw that video and maybe you didn't see that gorilla. Or maybe you did see the gorilla but didn't notice the other changes. And this has to do with the fact that we are unable, if we are paying attention to something, we are essentially blind to what we are not paying attention to, even if it's right in front of our nose. Which also makes you think about whether stuff like eyewitness testimony, how reliable that is. If our perception is so flawed so that if we're not paying attention to something, we don't really see it. So so again, we can be blind to many different things. Here's another example of change blindness. Take a look at what is going on in this scenario here. Young man is asking the older man for directions. The older man is helping him out, giving him directions. Two men come in passing by with a big board, carrying a big board. When they finish passing by, these two guys switch. And the older gentleman does not notice that it is a different person he's giving directions to. Because this is a completely unexpected change, then the person is blind to change. And there can be other examples of this as well in your daily life. If something is in the wrong spot, you might not notice it because it's maybe unexpected, and you're not paying attention to that. So different kinds of so again, realizing how much, if we're not paying attention to something, then we're not going to perceive. Then we're not going to really perceive it. We may be sensing it, but we're not perceiving it. Finally, another factor that plays a role in our perception is the fact that we have perceptual sets. We have often predispositions or a readiness to perceive something in a particular way. And this really reflects top-down processing. We have an idea of what we are expecting to perceive, and we thus perceive it. So if you're looking at the vertical column here, you see ABC. If you're looking horizontally, you're seeing 12, 13, 14. But that B and that 13 is the same stimulus. Just like in the when you looked at in an earlier lecture, the cat, you have the H and the A that are the same stimulus, but we perceive one as an H and one as an A. Ethnicity might also play a role in terms of how we perceive the world around us. We have expectations that can influence our perception. You may have expectations about people of different ethnicities. If you're brought up a particular way, you may have predispositions about what to expect in the world around you. And you might make perceptual errors, not because you are personally prejudiced, but because you have an awareness of these stereotypes that exist in your culture. So you may not even want to believe in a stereotype, but you may nevertheless behave in a certain way, or rather I should say perceive things in a way that is consistent with the stereotype. So this is something to consider, something to think about when we're talking about how we perceive the world around us. Maybe it's sometimes taking a step back and thinking about having a second thought about what we are perceiving. To what extent could we be perceiving things based on cultural stereotypes? Cultural context is important as well. Coming from a different culture, you might not be familiar with symbols and objects that are common in another culture. If you are looking at this may look like a family room setting, where this is a window and this is the back wall. But if you are an East African who maybe not have too many family rooms, you're more likely, it may not be that kind of a circumstance. You might see this woman as balancing a box on her head. She may carry a box on her head, while you may see a tree in the background, because you have more outdoor settings that are in your day-to-day life than someone in a Western culture. So bottom line here, if you look at perception, the biopsychosocial model applies here as well. There are biological influences, there are psychological influences, and there are social and cultural influences that determine what we are perceiving, our version of reality. Okay, so this is the connection between sensation and perception, seeing how our perception is our view of reality. So biological influences. Well, we've got the sensory receptors in our body. We recognize now how they work. So there's the biological, and there are individual differences in terms of how responsive we are to stimuli. There are psychological influences. What are we paying attention to? Maybe some person pays attention to one type of stimulus and another pays attention to something else. The Gestalt principles. This may be a lot of stuff that we learn. We might learn schemas. We might learn different expectations based on how we grew up. So these are psychological influences. Finally, there are social and cultural influences in terms of what we are expected to perceive in the people we meet. Do we automatically perceive that people are kind and good and treat them that way? Do we perceive people as somebody who is going to would want to have a guest in our home? Or do we perceive people as potentially dangerous and approach them with caution? Culture can play a role in terms of how we perceive these things.